I didn't want anyone to get the wrong idea, like I was attacking him or trying to tear him down, Yama Brown once said, when asked about speaking publicly on her father. I just needed people to understand what it was like to grow up with someone like him. What was he like as a dad? What was he like behind closed doors? Not just the entertainer on stage. Everybody already saw that part. She explained that when she first heard Hollywood wanted to make a movie about James Brown's life, he had mixed feelings. On one hand, it meant his story mattered. On the other, he knew exactly how the industry could twist black lives into caricature. According to Yama, he worried deeply about how a powerful, complicated black man would be portrayed by a system that rarely gave men like him any grace. On Christmas Day, 2006, just hours before James Brown was officially pronounced dead at Emory Crawford Long Hospital, something reportedly happened inside room 323 that still unsettles the people who claim they saw it. A night shift doctor who, according to hospital staff, resigned not long after, later insisted he walked past Brown's room and saw the singer speaking in a low, urgent tone to someone standing in the far corner. The only problem was that when the doctor stepped inside and turned on the light, there was no one there. Around that same time, miles away, Yama said her phone vibrated with a blocked call. When she answered, she didn't hear a normal voice. She described it as harsh, metallic, almost machine-like, rasping a single message. He will not die tonight. The bargain is made. He is protected. Then the line went dead so suddenly it felt, in her words, like someone cut it with a knife. Minutes later, with his organs reportedly close to collapse, James Brown suddenly sat bolt upright in his hospital bed. A nurse would later recall that his eyes flew open, like someone had yanked him back from somewhere else. For decades before that night, people around him had quietly traded the same story. That back in 1968, James Brown had made some kind of pact with a force he would never name out loud, and now, for the first time, his daughter Yama was prepared to walk through 5 pieces of proof that some believed showed her father struck a deal with Satan, and that this deal repeatedly pulled him away from death. Chapter 1. 1968. The Contract in the Dark. 1968 was the year America felt like it had forgotten how to breathe. Cities were burning, leaders were falling, and every black entertainer whose voice could move a crowd was watched, catalogued, and feared by the authorities. James Brown, already the most explosive presence in soul music, was right in the middle of that storm. Beneath the screams, the spotlights, and the footwork that seemed to defy gravity, he carried something heavier than gold records. He carried the burden of being a black man who refused to bow at a time when the system preferred its black stars grateful and quiet. According to FBI files later discussed by researchers, the Bureau's COINTELPRO program added his name to their list of persons of interest. His calls were logged. Faces backstage were photographed. Tours were quietly monitored under the excuse that a man who could electrify thousands of people in under 5 minutes might one day direct that power somewhere the government didn't like. James remained publicly silent about most of this pressure, but the people who lived on the road with him saw the effect. Night by night, they watched the circle tighten. The paranoia started as a whisper and grew into a constant hum, threatening messages. Strange cars parked too long, men in suits who never said who they worked for. It became harder to tell where danger ended and destiny began. And then came the night in Augusta, Georgia, December 1968, when everything quietly shifted. It was supposed to be routine, a hometown show at the Bell Auditorium, a packed house pressed shoulder to shoulder, waiting for the godfather of soul to ignite the stage. But backstage, something felt off. James was unusually subdued, as if his famous voltage had been turned inward. A young stagehand named Lloyd Mills later recalled that Brown told the crew he needed a few minutes alone before curtain time. That wasn't strange. Big stars often needed solitude before walking into the roar of a crowd. What was strange was what followed. James Brown stepped into his dressing room, closed the door, and did not come back out. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then half an hour. The band fussed with their instruments. The promoter paced, checking his watch every few seconds. Finally, Mills walked to the door, knocked, and called out, "Mr. Brown." There was no answer, not a sound. People backstage told themselves he was praying, meditating, maybe just refusing to be rushed. But when the door was finally forced open, the room was empty. James Brown, who multiple witnesses said they saw enter that room alone, was gone. There was no back door, no open window, no hidden hallway. On paper, disappearing from that space should have been impossible. And yet, the star of the show simply wasn't there. For 3 full hours, the backstage area dissolved into panic. Musicians traded theories in hoarse whispers: kidnapping, a secret FBI grab, revenge from groups that had threatened him on tour. The promoter imagined lawsuits. Security scoured the building. But at 11:27 p.m., long after the crowd should have been sent home, James Brown quietly walked in from the southern hallway. He was calm, too calm, and his skin, Mills later said, looked pale, like he'd seen something that didn't belong in this world. Mills would spend the next 30 years trying not to remember the expression on Brown's face. He later described it as the look of a man returning from a place he should never have visited. Brown's eyes were bloodshot, as if he had been crying hard, alone. His breathing was short and uneven, like someone who'd run a race without moving an inch. When Mills stepped forward and asked if he was okay, James leaned in and whispered a sentence the stagehand swore he never heard again before or after. "They gave me a way out," he said. "I took it." He didn't explain who they were. He didn't say what he was escaping or what price came attached. The only thing he demanded, with a quiet urgency that unnerved everyone, was that the curtain rise immediately. And that night, witnesses said, he performed like a man caught between exhaustion and possession, wild, driven, and almost feverish, as if some unseen clock was counting down. From that night forward, people close to him agreed on one thing: James Brown was not the same. Sleep, already scarce, became almost non-existent. He insisted every hotel curtain stay clamped shut, day or night. He warned the crew never to stand directly behind him, not even for a moment. He refused to ride elevators alone. Band members whispered that he believed something had latched onto him in that Augusta dressing room, something he couldn't push away. The godfather of soul, once the most fearless man on any stage, began flinching at shadows that nobody else could see. And what followed only deepened the sense that he was moving through a world tilted just a few degrees off from everyone else's. 10 days after the Augusta incident, James narrowly avoided an explosion in an Atlanta parking lot. He had just climbed into his car when the vehicle directly behind him erupted in a sudden burst of fire. According to reports, fire officials later stated that the blast did not appear to be the result of a simple mechanical failure. Something, they suggested, had been tampered with under the hood. Anyone standing within a few feet of that car would likely have died instantly. Witnesses said James stood by the burning wreck, watching flames crawl up into the night sky. Under his breath he muttered, "Not today." His tour manager later claimed he heard him add a second line in an even lower voice. "Not tonight. Not after the deal." No one standing there was willing to ask what deal he was talking about. 3 days later in Birmingham, Alabama, security at a venue reportedly intercepted a man with a handgun who had slipped past the outer perimeter and made it backstage. When police questioned him, he allegedly told them a voice in a dream had ordered him to reach James Brown before the contract locked in. Officers wrote him off as disturbed. The band, however, exchanged looks that said they remembered Augusta and they remembered the explosion. On December 20th, during another performance, a fan rushed the stage holding a sharp object, moving with such speed that stagehands barely registered what was happening. Yet somehow, James sidestepped at the exact fraction of a second that kept the attack from landing. Local TV footage later showed him turning just before the assailant lunged, the timing so precise it looked almost rehearsed. Musicians who had spent years watching his every move of them said later, his voice dropping as if afraid someone might overhear. He moved like he already knew it was coming. 3 potentially fatal moments in 10 days, all sidestepped with uncanny precision, all trailing the same night when James Brown reportedly walked into a locked room, vanished, and came back looking like he had been in a conversation with something no human being should ever meet. Those closest to him eventually gave that stretch of time a name. They called it the Augusta Shift, the night James Brown crossed an invisible line. Whether that line was spiritual, psychological, or something beyond either category is still argued in hushed tones. But almost everyone who stood near him in those days agrees on one point. James himself believed something happened to him in December 1968. Something he couldn't fully describe, something he couldn't completely outrun. And when people later asked what kept him alive through the explosions, stalkers, ambushes, and near-fatal incidents that seemed to orbit his life, he kept returning to the same 5 words, spoken with that same strange mixture of pride and dread. I made my way out. For those who watched him change the way his speech shifted, the way he avoided mirrors and dark corners, the way he behaved as if a second set of footsteps paced just behind him, that phrase didn't sound like simple testimony. It sounded like a warning. The kind of warning a man gives when he believes he survived, not because fortune favored him, but because he owed something for the protection he received. Chapter 2. 1973. The day he should have died. By 1973, James Brown had already survived more threats, explosions, and razor-thin escapes than most people could imagine. Inside the industry, some people said half terrified, half admiring that he had become impossible to kill. But what unfolded on October 23rd of that year wasn't a legend whispered on a tour bus or a rumor repeated by overexcited fans. It was documented, investigated, and filed away in official reports that still raise questions. South Carolina, early morning. Fog clung to the ground in pale bands, thin enough to see through yet thick enough to feel on the skin. James Brown was scheduled to take a private flight in a small twin-engine plane. A short hop he had done so many times it barely registered as a risk. Nothing about that morning hinted at catastrophe. No storm warnings. No mechanical alerts. No premonitions that within minutes everyone on board would be convinced they were about to die. Sitting next to him was Charles Bobbitt, his longtime manager, one of the few men Brown truly trusted. Bobbitt had a reputation for composure, a man who could handle chaos without flinching. Contracts gone wrong, angry promoters, last-minute changes. Bobbitt had seen it all. But even he later admitted that what he experienced on that flight carved a permanent scar into his memory. The plane took off smoothly, its engines humming as it climbed into patches of mist. At around 2,000 feet, the world below faded into white. The pilot radioed the tower, reporting a routine ascent and clear visibility above the clouds. James sat back in his seat, unusually quiet, staring out the narrow window with the tense stillness of someone listening for a sound no one else could hear. Then it happened. Without any warning, the right engine coughed. Bobbitt would never forget that sound, a sharp, cracking choke followed by a violent sputter that rattled the entire cabin. It was the kind of noise that makes the body react before the mind catches up, the kind that tells you something has gone terribly, fundamentally wrong. The pilot cursed under his breath, eyes flicking to the dials, hands moving fast. The right engine lost power completely. No thrust, no response. Dead. Within seconds, the left engine followed it into silence. The cockpit went quiet in a way that felt unnatural. No roar, no vibration, just the hollow rush of wind. The airplane stopped climbing. Then it stopped holding. And then, with a sickening inevitability, it began to fall. Bobbitt later described those seconds as pure, undiluted terror. Gravity took hold of the aircraft like an invisible hand had grabbed its nose and yanked it downward. Coffee cups floated. A pen lifted off the tray and drifted in the air, a slow motion proof that they were no longer flying, they were dropping. The pilot tried to restart the engines. Nothing. The instrument panel flickered, blinked, and then went dead. They were in free fall. Every rule of physics said this should end in fire. There was no logical reason why that plane would not slam into the ground at lethal speed, tearing apart into shrapnel and flame. James Brown may have survived a dozen previous dangers, but airplanes don't negotiate. They don't hesitate. They do not grant second chances. And yet, in the middle of that chaos, while Bobbitt clutched the armrest and the pilot shouted instructions swallowed by panic, James stayed unnervingly calm. In later retellings, Bobbitt said, "We're going down. I'm screaming inside." And James, he just looks at me like he's already seen how this ends. Then Brown gave him a statement, flat and strange, not comfort, not optimism, but something else entirely. "I told you I was promised protection," he said. "Not we'll be okay. Not we're going to make it. Promised protection." It was the same note he had struck after the Atlanta explosion in '68, the same tone after the near attack in Birmingham, a tone that didn't sound brave so much as resigned, as if the outcome had been arranged ahead of time in a place no one else could access. The plane continued to fall. 1,500 feet. 1,700. Through the cockpit glass, Bobbitt could see treetops now, sharp and fast, rising up like a field of spears, waiting to rip through metal and bone. The pilot shouted that the landing gear wouldn't deploy. There was no power to force it down. They weren't going to land. They were going to hit, belly first, the deadliest kind of impact for a small plane. At roughly 400 feet, something occurred that investigators would later struggle to categorize. The propellers began to spin again. There was no fuel flow restored, no confirmed engine ignition, no electrical system roaring back to life. And yet, the blades turned. Not fast enough to climb, not strong enough to truly fly, but just enough to slow the fall, just enough to drag against the air like a parachute made of steel and momentum. When the plane finally slammed into a dirt field outside Aiken, South Carolina, it didn't explode. It didn't roll into a ball of fire or disintegrate into scattered metal. Instead, it skidded across the earth, shrieking and groaning, violent but survivable. Seats jolted, bones rattled, but the cabin stayed intact. The pilot's first screams weren't of pain, they were of disbelief. Witnesses recalled him repeating one sentence over and over. "This is impossible. This is impossible." Bobbitt stumbled out of the aircraft, lungs burning, legs shaking so violently he could barely stand. But when James Brown emerged, he brushed dirt from his jacket like he'd stepped off a bumpy bus ride. Not a falling plane, not a single major injury. No blood, no broken bones. People at the scene said he moved like a man waking up from a strange dream rather than surviving a disaster. Emergency crews arrived quickly. No fatalities, no raging fire, just a damaged aircraft and a handful of shocked survivors. Later that day, the NTSB began its investigation. In the official report, one line stood out cold, clipped, and deeply unsettling. It referred to unusual mechanical behavior, noting that the engines had lost all power while the propellers somehow maintained enough rotation to slow the descent. The cause was listed as unknown. Aviation specialists argued about it afterward. Some blamed an obscure atmospheric anomaly. Others pointed toward undocumented maintenance issues. A few quietly floated the word sabotage, echoing the suspicions that had shadowed many of Brown's close calls. But none of those theories fully accounted for the central fact. Propellers do not spin with life-saving force when the engines are dead. Not like that. Not enough to make the difference between a crater and a skid. That night, in a quiet motel where the shaken crew tried to sleep, Charles Bobbitt pressed James about what he had said in the air. Protection from what? Protection from who? James didn't answer directly. He sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor like he was listening to something just beneath it. When he finally spoke, it was almost too soft to hear. "I told you," he said. "I was promised I'd be kept alive. I didn't ask for the details." Years later, Bobbitt would admit that this was the most frightened he had ever seen. The godfather of soul, not frightened of dying, but frightened of whatever might be keeping death at arm's length. For those who believed James Brown had struck some kind of bargain back in 1968, the 1973 plane crash became Exhibit A, the moment when familiar laws of science seemed to falter, when physics took a step back and something else stepped forward. Something James appeared to believe he owed. For people who already believed James Brown had made some kind of dark bargain back in 1968, the 1973 plane crash became their favorite piece of evidence. To them, it was the moment where science seemed to glitch, where physics stuttered, and something else stepped in, something James himself believed he owed. Chapter 3. 1988. The prison miracle. They say every legend eventually loses control. But in 1988, James Brown didn't just lose control, he outran it, outdrove it, and somehow survived a night that by all normal measures should have ended with his body on the highway. By the late 1980 seconds, the godfather of soul was no longer the invincible cultural earthquake he'd been in the 60 seconds and 70 seconds. The fame was there, the fire was there, but the landscape around him had shifted into something harsher. Crack cocaine had ripped through black neighborhoods. Record labels were moving their money toward younger artists. And James, always volatile, always explosive, was wrestling with demons the public only heard about in fragments. His marriage to Adrian had crumbled in full view of the headlines. Domestic incidents showed up in arrest reports and tabloid spreads. People whispered about drug binges, about paranoid rants in hotel corridors, about nights when he stormed down hallways like he was being chased by things no one else could see. But nothing compared to the morning of the 24th of September 1988, the day James Brown turned 3 states into a moving crime scene and somehow walked away alive. It started in Augusta, Georgia, inside a small office building he used for business. Brown reportedly became convinced that someone was trespassing on his property, using his restroom without permission. He burst through the door with a shotgun in his hands, furious, shaking, eyes wide and unfocused. Employees panicked, bolted outside, and called the police. When James realized officers were on their way, something inside him snapped, not the way an ordinary man breaks, but in a way that looked almost like he was answering a summons only he could hear. He ran back to his pickup truck, slammed the door so hard the frame shuddered, and stomped the accelerator until the tires screamed across the pavement. What followed became one of the most notorious police pursuits in music history. A high-speed chase that stretched across state lines and played out like a scene no one would have believed if it hadn't been documented. James Brown versus the law, with patrol cars, highway units, and eventually SWAT and federal vehicles joining the chase. He crossed from Georgia into South Carolina at a speed officers later measured at well over 90 miles per hour, weaving between cars, blasting through red lights, cutting across lanes, as if the basic rules that keep metal and flesh alive didn't apply to him. One officer said later that he drove like a man who either wasn't afraid of dying or didn't believe dying was an option. Sergeant Fred Harp, one of the men in pursuit, would later recount that Brown should have flipped that truck a dozen times. Each wild swerve, each near collision, looked like the moment when the chase would end in fire. But each time the truck seemed seconds from rolling, the vehicle straightened at the last possible instant, as if jerked back into alignment by unseen hands. As the miles piled up, the pursuit grew more desperate. Police deployed spike strips across the interstate. Brown's truck tore over them, shredding all 4 tires, sparks spraying from beneath the chassis as rubber disappeared and metal chewed the asphalt. And still, impossibly, the truck kept moving. To other drivers, it looked like something out of a nightmare. 4 blown tires, rims grinding the road, yet the vehicle lunged forward as if pushed by invisible momentum. When Brown crossed back into Georgia, the situation shifted from dangerous to potentially lethal. SWAT teams took positions, officers took aim, weapons ready. According to reports, someone shouted for him to stop. He didn't. Instead, he swung the battered truck across the median, directly into the path of armed officers. One wrong twitch, one split second of misjudgment, and the hardest-working man in show business would have been cut down in a barrage of bullets. But that's not how it ended. Sergeant Harp later explained what he saw. "We aimed," he recalled. "We fired warning shots. He was coming straight at us. He should have been dead. But then the truck slowed, out of nowhere. Not a full stop, not a normal brake. Just a sudden, unnatural deceleration enough for the officers to rush the vehicle, drag Brown out, and pin him down without firing the kill shots that seemed inevitable seconds before." To this day, Harp has insisted that the math didn't make sense. The speed, the angle, the distance. There was no obvious reason James Brown should have survived that final approach. And yet, he did. When officers finally wrenched him from the driver's seat, the truck was a wreck, tires destroyed, rims mangled, chassis scarred. But James Brown was alive, dazed, bruised, confused, breathing. Pinned to the ground in handcuffs, witnesses said he kept repeating the same phrase over and over, almost like a mantra. "I'm protected," he muttered. "I told you I'm protected." No one on that asphalt understood what he meant. No one asked. Back at the station, the strangeness only deepened. After a chase that should have sent his heart racing into dangerous territory, medics expected chaos in his vital signs. Instead, they found calm. His blood pressure was stable. His pulse was steady. One medic compared it to examining a man who had been resting quietly, rather than someone who had just outrun death on shredded tires. Reporters swarmed the courthouse. Headlines screamed, "James Brown in wild high-speed chase. Godfather of soul arrested after multi-state pursuit." The public saw a familiar narrative, another black superstar spiraling into madness under the weight of his own excess. What they didn't see were the fractures running through Brown's life at the time. His marriage to Adrienne was in ruins. Accusations of violence hung over him. Tabloids hinted at drug use, alter egos, and nights when he claimed to hear voices. Friends said he avoided mirrors. Band members said he prayed with an obsession that felt less like faith and more like bargaining. His business world was collapsing. Lawsuits, tax issues, disputes with labels, problems stacking so fast they nearly buried him. But one person saw a version of James the cameras never captured: his daughter, Yama. In her memoir, Cold Sweat, she described visiting him in jail. She sat across from him, separated by glass, looking at a father who seemed strangely calm, almost relieved. She asked him why. Why the chase? Why the risk? Why drive like he didn't care if he died? James leaned closer to the glass, raised his hand to meet hers on the other side, and told her, "Don't be scared, baby. I got something watching over me. Something even the police don't want to mess with." As a child, Yama interpreted it the way a child would: guardians, angels, good luck. But years later, after she learned about the 1,973 crash, the 1,968 disappearance, the threats, the attacks, the car that exploded behind him instead of under him, she began to wonder if what he was hinting at was not comforting at all. Maybe it was something far darker. Prosecutors pushed to make an example of him, a black legend brought low, a warning written in handcuffs and court dates. But even the judge on the case reportedly acknowledged that parts of the pursuit and arrest felt off. In the videos, the truck behaves like it's being yanked by an unseen force. In written reports, the phrase "unexplained deceleration" appeared more than once. Officers testified that trigger fingers almost tightened, that lethal shots nearly rang out, and yet something seemed to intervene in the final seconds. One veteran patrolman later told a journalist, off the record, "I don't know what James Brown had going for him that day, but it wasn't luck. It was something else. Something bigger than any of us out there." The public filed the whole episode under the familiar label of Celebrity Meltdown, another star burning out in real time. But the people who had watched James Brown cheat death again and again, starting from that locked room in Augusta, saw it differently. This wasn't random chaos. This was pattern. And when the prison doors finally closed behind him, one guard would later recall hearing James Brown murmur a final sentence under his breath, almost like a reminder to himself. "I told you," he said quietly, "they won't let me die." For those who believed in the whispers that his life had been bargained for decades earlier, the 1,988 chase wasn't just a scandal. It was evidence. Evidence that the Godfather of Soul was living on borrowed time, borrowed breath, and borrowed protection from something no one dared name out loud. Chapter 4. 1,992. 1,998. The Night Visitors. There comes a point in every legend's life when the public story ends and the private truth begins. For James Brown, that dividing line was the 1,988 chase. After that morning, his life stopped resembling the familiar arc of a fading celebrity and shifted into something stranger, a twilight zone between fame and fear, where unexplained events and unspoken anxieties became part of his daily routine. When he finally walked out of prison, people close to him said something fundamental had changed. The intensity was still there, that furnace of energy that had powered him through decades of grueling performances, but it no longer looked like hunger or ambition. It looked like urgency. He moved through crowds as if being timed, avoiding lingering conversations, cutting interactions short. He insisted on staying in rooms without windows or reflective surfaces. Assistants quietly learned there were hallways he refused to walk down, hotel floors that unsettled him, entire cities where he would become restless and sleepless for reasons he never explained. Industry observers shrugged it off as paranoia, the cost of long-term fame and public scandal. But the people who traveled with him, the ones who saw him in those unguarded in-between hours, noticed details that didn't fit any simple